Our DDG is unfortunately unable to join. So I'm going to give a welcome address on her behalf. My name is Xavier Edziwa. I'm the project director in the Jobs Fund. On behalf of the DDG of the Jobs Fund, we welcome all participants to this training session. We take this session very seriously, and it is important in the process of the application process. As we engage with our potential applicants, giving you guidance in terms of how to complete certain documents, what is required in particular sections. So this is really a session where we are opening up, giving you insights and giving you an opportunity to raise any question that you might have seeking any clarity. This funding round is a crucial funding round given where the country is after the impact of COVID. So you note in terms of our term sheet, we are talking about a post-pandemic recovery. How do you and I, that is how does the Jobs Fund and you as an organization join hands and work together and ensure that we enhance the productivity of the SMEs? How do we join hands to ensure that we create those employment opportunities for the youth and women in particular? In so doing, that is in joining hands that way, we are going to co-create a solution. And I urge everyone to be fully engaged in this discussion, and please feel free to ask questions and our team will respond. On that note, I wish you the best on the behalf of the DDG during this session. Thank you. Okay, I will now hand you over to Eldon, who will take us through some slides. Over to you, Eldon.
Thank you, Xavier, and good morning to everyone that's joined on the call, the training session today. I hope that it's going to be fruitful, and like Xavier indicated, if you can please post your questions onto the chat and we will respond accordingly. My section really talks about the overview of our application process and what are the next steps. In essence, we have a 6-stage delivery model, starting off with the need for opening up a call for proposal or funding round, and then moving on to a second stage, which is what we refer to as the AAA process. And essentially, this is the application, appraisal, and approval stage. And it's basically the starting point of our process and where we are today. This training session is aimed to ensure that we equip you with the information that you require to successfully submit your application as part of our 10th funding round. Importantly to note is that a large section of our presentation is aimed at that activity-based costing project implementation and monitoring plan, the ABC PIMP that Xavier referred to, where we actually would then plan on how your project would roll out, as well as what would be seen as the drawdowns for the funding for those particular segments of your implementation. Our third process, which leads on to, is the contract process, where we would then finalize the contracting process, and at this time, you will no longer be referred to as an applicant and rather our partner. The fifth stage is actually a very important stage, is the actual implementation of your project, as well as the monitoring of your rollout of your intervention. This is where we ensure that you are meeting your various milestones, that we are aligned in terms of the amount of money that is being disbursed to your project, to ensure that you are then able to achieve the various outcomes which are linked to our program indicators. And the final stage, which is also another important part of our work as the Jobs Fund, is the closeout and gathering the lessons learned through the implementation of your project in our partnership together. If we can just move to the next slide. So what are the next steps, noting that 6-phase process? The next steps is that, first of all, we are going through this training session. Again, I see a lot of comments have been posted around the recording. Yes, the recording will be available. We are aware of load shedding and maybe that some people would have registered and not been able to join, but essentially the training session is a kickstart to ensuring that we provide you and equip you with the most information that you would require in order to successfully submit your application through to the Jobs Fund. Importantly to note that the window closes on the 28th of March at 3 p.m. and please note that no exceptions will be made with regards to this deadline. You need to take note of all of the various steps that will be outlined throughout this process to ensure that you are have sufficient time in order to complete the necessary details on the application form, as well as in terms of the submission of documents. Now, you would see the second point talks about the completion of the ABC PIMP, which is what this training session today would be predominantly based on. We also talk about due diligence documents. I did note that there was a question about upload of documentation. There is a section within the online application that requires you to upload documentation. So there may be references within the application form that speaks to the upload of documents, and this would all be listed within that section of the application form. Please note that all uploads are compulsory. After we've actually completed the submission process, we would then run a process of eligibility to just check to see whether you are actually eligible in terms of the information and the submission through to the Jobs Fund, and you'll be informed of your eligibility status. Applicants will then also be engaged, those that are eligible, and be informed of due diligence arrangements. Now, this could happen in sort of two parts, whether it would be an on-site or a virtual meeting that will take place. And that's obviously dependent on the fund's risk assessment. Applicants that would then be deemed eligible after submission would be allocated to a project appraiser who would basically undertake the project appraisal. This individual would then be your contact person. You would also have access to the appraiser's manager. But also in this arrangement, we need to ensure that we are all in the same communique with regards to any responses or questions that would be raised at this particular point in time. Very importantly is that we need to be very responsive when there are queries, because at that stage of submission and the appraisal stage, there might be a need to just clarify some of the gray areas that may have been articulated in your application. It's important that you cooperate with us, ensure that you are available to answer the queries timelessly so that it doesn't delay the process. And then lastly, that contracting would then take place once our independent investment committee approves our applications at this particular stage. I'm going to pause here before I move on to the next stage, and maybe my colleagues, I see that the chat is moving. Thank you very much for that. I'm not sure, colleagues, if there's anyone that could maybe point me out to a specific question that needs to be addressed. All right, I think it's being handled at the moment. All right. What I am going to be moving towards now is the next part of the training session is really around the completion of our activity-based costing project implementation monitoring plan, the ABC PIMP. And what I will do now is we are currently emailing the template of the ABC PIMP through to those that had registered. So you would have received an email from us that will allow you to then walk yourself through and use that as a navigation point as we go through the next segment. But for those that have not completed it yet, have not registered onto our online portal, I'm just going to take you through a very short demonstration, and just note that I will be doing another demonstration later on and reiterating these steps. So I'm just going to start sharing now quickly. Right. If my screen is visible. Xavier, could you indicate is my screen visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So in order to navigate to our online application, in order to download the ABC PIMP template, it's fairly simple. What you would do, and I'm sure that it will be posted within the chat if it hasn't been done so already, is that you would have to access the Jobs Fund's website, which is http://www.jobsfund.org.za. And once you've landed on the homepage of the Jobs Fund's website, the very first area that you would see talks about the announcement of the new funding round. And there's a button on the right-hand side here that says read more, or on the left-hand side, we actually have a sliding menu that talks to the new funding round and the current calls for proposal. By clicking either link, it will direct you to the appropriate page on our website that will give you very important information around the specific funding round. And I'm sure a lot of you have done this step already. But what's important to note is that there are certain documents, as well as after the session, we would then upload the training video that is recorded today. But importantly, if you haven't done so already, if you can download the term sheet, which is important, the 10th CFP application user guide, which is the step-by-step guide on completing the online application form via our online portal, and as well as the frequently asked questions document, which is a live document and will be updated based on responses that have come out of our briefing session, queries that have been raised through our help desk, as well as anything that comes out of this particular training session. There's an apply button that once you've clicked that apply button, it will redirect you to our online portal. And at this stage, once you're on our online portal, there is an area for you to register your details, which will allow you to then gain access to our online portal. Once you have registered onto the online portal, and again, I reiterate, I am going to go through the section within my segment a little bit later on. But once you've registered onto the online portal, what's important to note is that you would then go to the create new application section that will allow you to create the online application form. Once you have created or registered your details, and this would ask you for a few pertinent details such as the type of window you're applying under, your project name, the type of business that you are. After that initial registration step, you would then receive a reference number, which would start with JF10. and then be sequential thereafter. It's important to note that reference number, because if you do run into any technical or non-technical queries and access our help desk, it's important that you provide us with that reference number in order for us to be more efficient in answering your particular query. Once you have received that registered number, what you'll notice that the very first screen that you would access is the eligibility criteria tab, which we will take you through step by step in the segments that will allow us to take you through this here. But this is the important part of this segment, is that on the right-hand side of the application form, you would see a number of different templates, which is in the form of hyperlinks that would then allow you to download and save these templates onto your computer. The one that we are most interested in right now is the ABC PIMP, and it's simply clicking on the link. It will pop up and allow you to actually save this document onto your desktop, onto your computer, whatever device you're using. So just to go through the steps one more time. So from the login page, once you have accessed the online portal, you would create your new application, do a pre-registration. Once you have completed the registration and received the reference number, on the right-hand side of the application form, you would see all the applicable templates, which we will be running through as part of this training session, that you would then download, as some of them are required for you to complete in order for you to submit your application. I think I'm going to pause just here to see if there's any questions that I need to take. Maybe my colleagues can assist me if there's anything that I need to go over. But just to note, once again, participants, that we will be going through the step-by-step process again, in terms of the section that specifically talks about the online application form, where we will go a little bit at a slower pace to go through these steps that I've just reiterated. I think we would then move to our next presenter. Xavier, if we can hand back over through to yourself.
Thank you very much, Eldon, for the brief on how to access the GMS and also how to access to the various tabs. As you did indicate, there will be another discussion later on where you come back again, giving specific details on each tab. Colleagues, we now come to this section where we're looking at the overview of the ABC PIMP, the architecture of that, the functionality of that. And with that, I now hand you over to Kath. Over to you, Kath.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the how-to guide for the ABC PIMP. This section will provide a high-level overview of the PIMP, how it's designed and set up, and its overall functionality. So what does the ABC PIMP stand for? It's quite a mouthful. It's the Activity-Based Costing Project Implementation Monitoring Plan. And it essentially helps us to understand how a project aims to effectively achieve their proposed outcomes and objectives. It assists projects in determining their activities, so the activities the project will undertake, and then it also adds the element of the costs and outputs associated with those activities. So after completing the ABC PIMP, the following key questions will be answered for the proposed intervention. What will the project produce and when? When will the activities take place and when will the related costs be incurred? What is the overall project cost? How will these project costs be financed? And what are the project's overall objectives? So essentially, this ABC PIMP maps out the results chain. But unlike the traditional results chain, it also includes cost elements and the timing, the key timing of all those deliverables. So it'll cycle through project inputs, activities, outputs, and finally outcomes. So the ABC PIMP will identify the logical flow of key activities and associated outputs that your project will undertake during implementation. It'll cover the project inputs. What do we need to implement this initiative? How much grant funding do we require? And then how much match funding are we going to commit? It will also cover the project activities. What are the actions we need to take that will result in those desired outputs and outcomes that we seek to achieve? It will also highlight the project outputs. What are those anticipated immediate results of the activities and the intervention? Then it will show the outcomes. What are these long-term benefits or changes for project beneficiaries or the value chain or the market system? So in addition to the standard results chain, the PIMP contains the detailed timing of deliverables. When will these activities take place? When do I anticipate the outputs? And then it also goes a step further and it itemizes the costing for each of those activities. I'm going to show you how the ABC PIMP is set out. It consists of 10 tabs, but only 4 of which need to be completed by the applicant. So the first tab is the project information tab. The section requires the applicant to detail all the general project information. It's important to add the information here because it's pulled into other tabs throughout the PIMP. The second tab is the project implementation plan. This outlines your activities, the associated outputs, your outcomes, and finally your costs. So it'll go through what does the project do, how will the project roll out, what will the project produce and when, and what will the project achieve. Then the third tab is the financing plan. And this section requires that the applicant illustrates how the costs of the project will be covered. So how will the project's costs be financed? And the fourth tab is the funding allocation tab. And this funding allocation is used to indicate which funding source is paying for which project expense. This information is important during the project implementation phase when assessing the project's cash flow needs relative to its budget. It's really important that each applicant keeps track of all the versions of the plan in the version control tab. So really important, adhere to the naming convention and update your versions in that version control tab. So let's run through each of the 4 tabs. Your first tab is the project information tab. It's really important that the applicants complete this in its entirety because, as I said before, some of this information will then pull through into the rest of the PIMP. So it includes things like how much grant funding you've requested, the match funding committed, your proposed implementation start date, your project name, number, etc. So really important, fill in those yellow shaded cells. Let that be the first thing that you do on the PIMP. Tab 2 really starts to show you how the results chain is mapped out in the ABC PIMP. Now the slide I'm showing you, you won't be able to see clearly. I've zoomed out so everyone gets a bird's eye view of what this particular tab consists of. So you'll see on the far left, there are a few columns to outline the project activities. Emanating from each activity or a series of activities, there will be associated outputs. So this is included in the next 2 columns. The timing of these activities and outputs will also be mapped out in the target section. So the applicants will need to add targets for the particular outputs that they have. Applicants will then need to highlight how much will these activities cost to undertake. So in that middle section, the activity-based costing section, they'll list all the costs with the associated SCOA code per cost item. We'll go into this in more detail in the slides that follow. Then finally, on the far right, you get your implementation schedule, which shows the timing of that budget. So when will the costs be incurred? So now that I've given you that broad overview, I want to zoom in a little bit more into the activities and outputs section. So applicants are required to identify the key categories of activities that their projects will undertake to reach their end goal. So for example, this could be the recruitment and onboarding of young people into the program. It could be the training of those young people, finally allocating them to potential placement partners, and then forming further partnerships for furthering those young people's opportunities throughout the initiative. So in the PIMP itself, if you have it open in front of you, you'll see there's 7 activity categories in total. So each activity category will revolve around a specific set of actions and outputs. So for example, your first activity category could revolve around the recruitment and onboarding of participants for your particular project. So within each of those activity categories, applicants will set out sub-activities that their project will undertake. If, for example, activity category 1 revolves around the recruitment of participants onto the program, we could have a sub-activity there that revolves around the advertising of the initiative in the market so that potential participants hear about the initiative and then go ahead and apply for the initiative. So under that sub-activity, we could talk about the various adverts to be placed in community newspapers and the design of those adverts. We need an advert design. Who will it be designed by? Is it the project's internal comms team? Will they need to recruit a designer externally to develop that advert? And then what sort of overall output would we expect from that sub-activity? In this case, it could be the number of adverts placed in community newspapers. Then in the targeting section, you would need to tell us, so how many adverts will you place and when? Will this advertising campaign be rolled out over a few periods, or will it be completed within the first project period? In addition, for each of those activity categories, applicants must highlight the overall milestone output. This milestone will then be pulled into the outcome section, which we'll discuss a little bit later. But this milestone indicator will really show, like overall, out of the activity category, this is the output that we anticipate achieving. Applicants need to ensure that activities are largely sequential, but I mean in some instances we do understand that there may be some overlap in terms of flow, and no project is purely linear. So we'll have some instances where certain activity categories will be rolled out concurrently. The last activity category, activity category 7, is a standard and compulsory activity category. So it forms an umbrella over all activities and it revolves around monitoring and evaluation. So you will be required to perform a number of M&E activities which will have specific outputs and also have specific timing and targets. So when we reflect on the results chain mapping in the PIMP thus far, we've covered activities and we've covered outputs. So let's move on to costing. So here we're still under tab 2, but now we're moving to the columns within the middle of that tab, and we're looking at the activity-based costing. So So this section requires that the applicant cost each activity and then show the basis for that costing in order to answer the overall question. So what will these activities cost under each activity category? So applicants will describe the cost and the quantum thereof. They'll also classify it as per the SCOA coding. So will this fall under goods and services? Is this management fees? Is this compensation, for example? And then document the assumptions for that cost. So if we use our advertising example, how much does it generally cost to advertise in a community newspaper? So you will add those cost assumptions of what it cost you last year and then make the assumption, has it gone up, etc., etc. So we understand, when we're reading through this PIMP, we understand what those costs are actually based on. As shown by the slide, this costing is directly aligned with the activity. So you'll see there on the far left, you've got your activities, and then the associated costs are in the same row as that activity. So if we look at activity 1.1, what are the costs associated with that activity? And then the final step in completing tab 2 is looking at the implementation schedule, which still relates to costing, but it revolves around the timing of the budget. So when will I need the budget for these particular activities? So it shows the timing of each activity and then the timing of the breakdown of the costs incurred for each cost item in that activity. The applicants are required to split the funds in the respective periods in line with how they're likely to be spent. As with the previous section, this detail is to be included in the same row as the activity it is associated with. So if you see on the left-hand side of the screen, you've got your activities. The timing of the budget is within the same row, so we understand when the activity will take place. We've got that in the targets on the left-hand side, but then on the far right, it also shows the costs associated with that activity and the timing thereof. Let's reflect again on the results chain mapping in the PIMP thus far. We've covered activities, we've covered outputs, and we've covered the costing. So now let's move on to the outcomes. In tab 2, from row 159 onwards, houses the anticipated outcomes section. This outlines the end goals of the project. So what is the project's end game in terms of the social outcomes? And what is the timing of that outcome realization? So these outcomes include the Jobs Fund program indicators, for example, the number of jobs to be created by the initiative. The section also includes the identified milestone indicators, which the applicant identified in the activity categories above. So these automatically get pulled into the outcomes section. And then any other project-specific indicators that projects wish to highlight and track. So these indicators are outcomes that relate directly to your particular intervention. So for example, if your project is going to establish a hub for youth work seekers, where perhaps they can access career guidance, other training opportunities, etc., then this particular indicator should be added as a project-specific outcome. So when will this hub be finally established, and when can young people then start accessing that service? This section of the PIMP also requires that applicants nominate means of verification for each of their indicators. So means of verification refer to the evidence that will support a project's reported outcomes. For example, when it comes to job creation, the expected means of verification would be job contracts. So then when a project reports to the Jobs Fund that they've created 40 jobs, those 40 jobs will be accompanied by 40 employment contracts. In addition, projects also need to identify the assumptions that inform those indicators. So for example, what are the assumptions that inform the targets? So if I anticipate I'm going to create 100 jobs each month, so maybe 300 during the quarter, what has informed those targets? Do I have offtake agreements in place with potential employers that will place young people in jobs? Do I have that secured? What has informed my targeting, and what have I based that on? So it's important to include those assumptions in the PIMP as well. Now that we've come to the end of tab 2, let's reflect on the results chain mapping in the PIMP thus far. So we've covered our activities in tab 2, we've covered outputs, we've looked at our activity-based costing, and now we've just covered outcomes. So there is, however, a need to further unpack the financial model in the project, and this is done in the remaining 2 tabs. So let's move on to the next tab. So now we're in the financing plan. This section requires that the applicant illustrate how the cost of the project will be covered. So how will the project's costs be financed overall? So the applicant must indicate how much funding will be obtained under each category. So in terms of grant funding, how much funding has been requested, in what quarter or period will the drawdown take place, when will they require this grant funding, in addition, what match funding are they putting in, where does this match funding stem from, is this their own contribution, is this an in-kind contribution, is this match funding coming from loan financing, and also when will the drawdown take place. After completing the financing plan, the applicant will then move on to tab 4, the final tab, which is the funding allocation sheet. This is used to indicate which funding source is paying for which project expense. This information is very important, particularly during the implementation phase, when we're assessing the cash flow needs of a project relative to its budget. So when you look at the top of the sheet, the source of funding is listed in about the first 10 rows. So this section requires the applicant to allocate the total income under each subcategory. So we're talking about the grant funding, the matched funding, and the various sources of match funding, and then project revenue where applicable. Then as you go down the page, we get to the uses of funding and the funding split. These sections require that the applicant split the expense into the proportion being paid by various funding sources, the various funding sources being the grant, the match funding, etc. So what it's doing is showing which percentage of the particular expense is being paid by the grant funding, by the match funding, and by other project income where applicable. So when you get to this point in the PIMP, some celebrations are in order because you are almost there. These 2 tabs I want to look at now are automatic summaries that are pulled through from the rest of the PIMP. So under this particular summary, this is a pre-populated sheet that pulls through from the financing plan, so the inflows of funding, and the activity output, outcome, and costing sheet. It provides an overall view of your SCOA budget, so looking at planned income, your planned expenditure, and it also provides a table and a summary of the initiative outcomes, as well as the cumulative grant and match funding over time, over the project periods, as well as the cost per job. The final summary tab is an overview of the project as a whole, the project name and details, the outcomes, and then a summary of the total income, and then a summary of total expenditure. Before you crack open the bubbly and start shouting from the rooftops that you finished the PIMP, please check in with your project team. Assess, have I done everything? Have I completed everything? Is everything balancing in the PIMP? Have a look at that example. There is an example tab of how to complete an activity category. Ensure that your PIMP is aligned to the principles that are shown in that example. Please don't copy and paste. We will know Really, this PIMP is for your project. Anyone picking up this PIMP for the first time should be able to read through it and really get the gist of the project, what you will be doing step by step, what you're trying to achieve, and overall how much the project will cost. So thank you very much for listening, and all I can say is good luck and happy pimping.
Thank you very much, Kath, for the presentation on a pre-recording. Colleagues, we did the pre-recording given the challenges we're obviously having of load shedding and so forth. We found it's going to be an efficient way of communicating via a pre-recording. Kath, if you can just come in, I was checking on the questions. There's one question that has been asked, but I think maybe you may just give an overview. The question was the issue of having an independent M&E resource person to assist the applicant in completing the ABC PIMP. Would you like to say more about that, Kath?
Sure. I mean, look, at this stage during the application process, applicants may then, get assistance in completing that. With regards to the activity category 7, which is the M&E section, I also notice a number of questions coming through on that about what is involved, who has to contract an independent M&E firm and when. And I want to say this will be further elaborated on in much more detail in the next demo segment. So bear with us on that one. I also noticed there were a few other questions coming through. One of them was, is the PIMP locked? There's certain sections in the PIMP that are locked. So those summary tabs, for example, applicants won't be able to edit that. Their formulas pulling through from the rest of the PIMP. So they won't be able to edit anything there. But in the yellow shaded cells, anything that's yellow shaded, that's where the applicant then inputs all the information on their project. I also want to reiterate that this submission, it's a compulsory submission, so it forms part of your application. So really take the time and the care to do it well. So don't be afraid of the PIMP, embrace the PIMP. So in addition to mapping out your whole results chain and your budget as well, it also will provide you with a sense check of the assumptions that are informing your targets as well as your timelines. So take the time to reflect on what can you actually feasibly do in 2 years, so within 24 months. So take a step back, really assess your assumptions and make sure that they are valid. So at the end of the day, if your project is approved, you want to be able to roll out unencumbered and receive those, those disbursements on time. I also noticed there are quite a number of questions on matched funding. And how you input that into the PIMP and some of the expense items. And these will also be covered in the finance demo that follows. So a lot more detail on how you actually begin to complete that PIMP step by step. So I think we can proceed to the next question now, the next section. Thanks.
I'm now going to take you through the project example. You should have all received this example via email. If not, one of my colleagues is going to post it in the chat and you can download it now. So this example project will be used to demonstrate how the PIMP will be completed, the level of detail that you need to input, and then the considerations to be taken into account under each of the sections. So in the training segments that follow, the team are going to use this example to then take you through the PIMP step by step and input detail based on this particular project. Please note that this is an example project, so it's not a real project, and is used for illustrative purposes only. Let's go through the overview. The project title, so the name of the project is Removing Barriers to Youth Employment. The lead partner is Advantage Employment Consultancy. There are 2 implementing agents as well, Youth World Skills Development and Youth for Jobs. The locations of where the project is going to be implemented, it's just in Mpumalanga. Target sectors are business process outsourcing and ICT. The grant funding being requested by the project is 10 million. Matched funding is also 10 million, so matched 1-to-1. Cash contributions, the own cash contribution is 8.25 million. Contributions from other sources, which is the Vista Foundation in the case of this initiative, is 1.75 million. Then there's some in-kind match funding of 1 million rand. So going on to the expected project outcomes, indicator 2, the project is anticipating 15 permanent placements beyond project partners. Indicator 2.2, which is number of fixed term placements beyond project partners. So that's a contract of 12 months or more. So another 15 placements there. Indicator 3, which is number of permanent placements with project partners. The goal there is to achieve 136 placements. Indicator 3.2, which is the number of fixed term placements with project partners. So that's again a contract of 12 months or more. That's at 233. And then indicator 6, the number of trained beneficiaries, is targeted at 456. So in addition to those overall program indicators, the project has also set out 5 project-specific indicators for the project. So they are going to track the number of candidates enrolled onto the program at 456, the number of participants completing soft skills training, also at 456. So it's anticipated that all of those enrolled will then complete that soft skills training. Number of participants completing the BPO training is at 325. Number of participants completing ICT training is at 108 participants. And then the number of employers partnered with, and then of course they will sign offtake agreements for the placement of those participants. There are 15 of those offtake agreements targeted. So let's go through the overall project description. Advantage Employment Consultancy, a for-profit company, has provided employment services in Gauteng, Northwest and in Mpumalanga for over 15 years, and this has been predominantly in the ICT and BPO sectors. They have a database of over 500 clients to which employment services are rendered. During this time, so over the last 15 years, Advantage has seen firsthand the multiple challenges faced by work seekers in taking advantage of the opportunities that do actually exist in the labour market. And the issues mentioned are based on the fact that unemployed youth cannot afford to look for employment. So high data and transport costs, for example, inhibits resource-constrained young people from seeking out these available initiatives. Additionally, there's often a gap in terms of level of skills that employers are looking for and what potential employees possess. So there's a large gap there. These constraints not only inhibit and discourage the work seeker, but also limit the expansion potential of the businesses in the region, with obviously a knock-on negative impact on economic growth, as firms are not willing to take the financial risk to hire new recruits who are unlikely to adequately fulfill the requirements of the role due to that specific skills gap. So this vicious cycle perpetuates the levels of poverty and therefore unemployment in the area. Advantage proposes to address this problem by piloting an innovative initiative to provide unemployed young people with a support mechanism to enable them to access and take advantage of the opportunities available. So the pilot will be focused on opportunities within the business process outsourcing sector and the information and communications technology sector in the main, which are the current growth sectors in South Africa. It will be implemented in and around the Mbombela area, Nelspruit area, where Advantage has a presence and the necessary capacity in place to actually roll out the initiative. So unemployment amongst youth in this particular area counts as one of the highest in the country at 74.5%. So this pilot will attempt to show that with the correct support, the proportion of unemployed young people that are able to access existing opportunities can then increase well beyond the current 25%. So the initiative will encompass the following. It will establish a youth-centric walk-in advisory centre in Nelspruit. So this will be at the project's existing site. This will be complemented by the development of an online portal by a service provider. The site is currently staffed with qualified consultants and support staff, and then for this project additional staff will be required to implement at the scale envisaged. The centre will provide the young person with the ability to firstly discuss issues faced with a qualified consultant, be assessed to what skills they currently have, and receive career guidance post all the assessments to be conducted, be referred to project partners for soft skills training and CV development services. Candidates will also receive a stipend to cover transport costs to and from training venues. As you saw earlier, one of the main challenges is the cost of looking for work. So that stipend will then cover the costs associated with transport. In addition, they will be referred to project partners for training in BPO or ICT related roles. So that will be dependent on their aptitude and the outcomes of that skills assessment. Candidates will again receive a stipend to cover transport costs to and from training venues. The candidates will also receive advice on and be linked with appropriate opportunities that would have been sourced from participating employers in the area. So really trying to match the demand in the area. In addition, the project will refer young people not interested in or that do not have the aptitude for BPO ICT related roles to other project partners who will then be able to source opportunities for these young people in other sectors. The delivery of suitable candidates to partner employers as per their specification and requirements, so being responsive to the demand from employers and then delivering those specific candidates with those skills to the employer. Then the project will also monitor the progress of the candidates throughout the various opportunities, and then also provide learnings and good practice to inform the scaling of the model. So this is a pilot. So one of the fundamental elements in the initiative is to ensure all the good practice and learnings are collected as they roll out the pilot, and that can then be used to inform the subsequent rounds of the initiative. So the project will partner with 2 implementing partners who have an excess of 10 years experience in their field of interest. So the first implementing partner, Youth World Skills Development NPC, and then the second implementing partner, Youth for Jobs NPC, are providers of focused training programs that are designed to provide the candidates with both technical skills required for the roles and then also to prepare the candidates for the world of work. So some soft skills training there. So candidates will be referred to these partners as required. The project will require total cash funding of 20 million rand to implement. So cash match funding of 10 million is available. This consists of 8.25 million from the applicant themselves, so from Advantage Employment Consultancy, and then 1.75 million from the Vista Foundation. So we've got an approval letter as well for that matched funding from the Vista Foundation. Although they have received the allocation letter from Vista Foundation, the funding will only be released annually in equal parts in Q3 of each financial year. The grant request from the Jobs Fund is therefore 10 million rand to match the cash match funding contribution from the applicant. And then in addition to this 20 million in total, the Advantage Employment Consultancy will provide an in-kind contribution to the project. So that's in-kind of 1 million, as we saw earlier. And this in-kind contribution is in the form of, firstly, personal protective equipment, so masks and sanitizer, and then stationery for the young people who access the services at the centre. And secondly, the services of an in-house industrial psychologist for specialist referrals where required.